Hello, welcome to Stories in Time. My name's Ellouise Schottler. I'm the storyteller. I have a new story. It's from my childhood. I remembered it recently, and I'm going to tell it to you today. In 1944, I was at boarding school 15 miles from Charlotte because my daddy was overseas, my mother was working, she couldn't handle everything. So my sister and I were at Sacred Heart Academy, taught by the Sisters of Mercy. Then, what do you know? The war was over. My daddy was not in India anymore. And the first thing that happened, with time, the Army had to issue him out and everything. Daddy came home, the end of 1944. We were all very excited. He got home in time for Christmas, and that was so good. It was wonderful, except at the end of the Christmas holiday, Mother and Daddy explained to me that I wouldn't be going back as a student. We would just be going back to get my clothes. That now that Daddy was home, we were all going to be living in our apartment again, and I would be going up the street to the Elizabeth School. Well, it sounded good to them, but it didn't sound good to me, because his coming home right now meant that I would not get my uniforms. I was going to be in the 4th grade. I would not get my uniforms that I had been waiting for a year and a half. They'd had to been measured and, well, that's the story. I didn't get my uniforms. And when we got back to the apartment, Linda had her things and I had my things, and we were 3 girls in 1 bedroom. I had been sleeping in a room with 14 beds. Little different. 3 sisters, double beds. You know, we had the double beds. I slept on the top, Linda slept on the bottom, and Kathy, the youngest one, slept in a twin bed on the other side of the room. Now this was all right. We had done this before, and so we went right back to where we had been. And we went back to the Elizabeth School, which was only about 7 blocks away, and it was an easy walk. And I had done that before when I was walking to school. It's hard to make changes, isn't it? It can be really hard. So for the 5th grade, Mama and Daddy decided that we could come away from Elizabeth School and to get back into the Catholic schools where we had been in Belmont at Sacred Heart. They sent us to a Donahue school on the other side of town, the other side of Charlotte. And I, as the oldest of the 3, was going to be in charge of taking them to and back from school. Well, it was a hard job. You may not think it was a hard job, but it was. We had to get together. Mother was working. We had to get together, go down to the street, cross Hawthorne Lane in the morning to the corner across the street, and wait for the city bus. The city bus, you got into the city bus, and there was this tall thing there that you dropped your coins in, made these tinkling sounds as you dropped them down. I had to have the money. I had to keep all that, take care of that, and see that they got seats, hopefully up near the front, but if they didn't, we tried the 3 of us to sit together, and that wasn't always possible. And we rode for about 20 minutes to get downtown. To the place where we got off was right at the center of the square. That's the center of Charlotte, North Carolina, at the square. Trade going this way and Tryon going this way. But our bus was now going to be on Tryon Street corner. So I had to get them off the bus, make sure that I got all the things I brought on and that they got all the things they brought on, and then we crossed the street with the traffic, watching so that we were walking with people who were walking across the street to that corner, and we waited there till the bus came. The bus came and we got on, and we had to put in more coins. Plink, 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 plink. And that was about a 25-minute ride over to a Donahue school. It was hard. That's the truth. It was hard. It was difficult. I looked around. My sisters looked around. We talked about some things. But the person that was so unhappy was my little sister, Kathy. She was in kindergarten, and she didn't want to be on the bus. She wanted to stay home. I don't know why I can't stay home with my mother. Because Mama's at work now. Daddy's home, Mama's at work, and this is how she's told us that we're going to do it. So Kathy finally figured out a way to have it like she would want it. Is we would ride over. It would come, the bus stopped for the children in school right across the street from the front door of the school. We all got out. We waited until the streets had emptied, and then everybody walked over at one time. And when Kathy was in a really bad way about not wanting to leave home that day, she would just wet her pants. And she'd get to the classroom and she would wet her pants. And I was there in the 5th grade across the hall, and Sister would come and get me and say, Elouise, you're just going to have to take your sister home. I missed a lot of school that year until she got settled in school and decided that she would come every day, have a good time, and stay. So the second year, 6th grade, they were a little more independent. I was much more independent. But we loved it there. You know why? It smelled like Sacred Heart. It smelled like beeswax. And when the candles were burning on the base of the stand where the statue was standing in the hallways. And there were these statues with the candle standing on a sort of a tall table at the foot of all the steps. And it smelled like Sacred Heart. And I felt comfortable. I felt comfortable there. I loved it because once we got home, went back, that whole thing, back around, and I was taking piano lessons, but I didn't have a piano. My aunt had a piano, and she was still living at home with her mother, my grandmother, who lived about 6 blocks away, and I had to walk over to Granny's to practice the piano. Get home, we'd get settled at home, and then I would go to practice the piano lessons. I loved it. I loved any time I could ever go to my grandmother's. She lived on 7th Street, 2308 East 7th Street. It was a wide street. It was a main street in that neighborhood. And it went all the way downtown into the center of town. So it could be very busy. And I would walk over there, and I liked to read. And when I walked, I read. I usually had a book with me, and I would walk along reading my book. It was always fine, never gave me a single problem, until one afternoon. It was in the fall, and it had begun to get a little bit dark, and I had to go home. So I was out walking toward home, and I was reading my book, and there were trees all along the edge of the 7th Street, both on the sidewalk where I was walking and the other side of the street. There was another sidewalk, and there were tall trees, and the leaves were out like this. And so it was a little darker than it really was when you were under all that shade. And I was reading my book deep into it. But I heard something that was different. I looked up, and there was somebody walking toward me. And as the person came closer, I looked, and it was a tall man. And he looked like a big, strong man. And he was wearing a long beige raincoat. It wasn't raining, but he had on a raincoat, and it was all closed up. And he was coming down that sidewalk toward me. I looked back at my book, and when I looked up, he had opened his raincoat. His raincoat was flopping on either side of him. And as he got closer, I didn't know what I was seeing. I didn't really know what I was seeing. His raincoat was wide open. Himself was in that raincoat, and he was buck naked. He didn't have any clothes on under that raincoat. And I heard his voice. It was a rough, deep, rough voice. And it said, "Little girl, have you had your blood yet?" What's that? Have I had my blood? I haven't cut myself. I don't know. What is he talking about? But it scared me. Nobody'd ever asked me that before. It scared me, and I was scared. That's true. But I jumped over to the side toward the street, and I stepped down into the street, and I started running as fast as I could up 7th Street. I knew exactly where I was going to go, where I thought it would be safe. I ran 3 blocks as fast as I could to get to Stanley's drugstore. It was a fairly small store, but we knew the pharmacist that owned it, Doc Stanley. I thought, Doc will be there. He will be in this store. And so I went in, and I saw him back in the back, but I didn't go back there because I decided that first I was shaking all over. I wanted to get better, to be settled. I was 11 years old, and I was shaking all over because some strange man had just spoken to me. And I slid down and sat on the floor next to the comic books. And I was looking at the comic. I knew he wouldn't stop me. He had let me come in there before and read the comic books when I was waiting for something or somebody. So he came out and he said, "Ellouise," and I said, "Hello, Doc, how are you?" And so we talked for a minute, but I didn't tell him. I didn't ask him to help me. I didn't ask him about it. And after a time, I figured I had been there long enough and that it was probably safe for me to go back outside. And I did, and I looked to the right, to the left, and I took a deep breath, and I started running toward my house, which was about 8 blocks away. And I ran, and I ran, and I ran. And I never told anybody what had happened to me on 7th Street. I was afraid that my daddy would flip out and would be too upset and would take me with him when he went to the police. I didn't want to do that, so I didn't say anything to him. I didn't take Mama aside and tell her either because I was embarrassed that it had happened. What had I done that had made that man stop to speak to me? Nothing. I finally told somebody years later. I told my husband, and he looked at me and he said, "It wasn't your fault." No, it wasn't my fault. Thank you for coming. The places we go are not always as safe as we hope, and so we have to look around and see what's happening. Thank you for coming.